Thanks a lot, Yvette. Since this is the first lecture of this year, of the semester, and as Yvette mentioned that we lost a very dear friend and a visionary, I don't think we would be here today. I don't think I would be here today without Rich Newton's vision and help and energy. And so let me start by, I'd like to dedicate this talk to his honor, his memory. Also, let's take just a moment of silence to honor him. Thank you. So, before I start, I'd like to thank some of the people who contributed to this talk. Some of my students who are sitting there having lunch. And a good friend of mine, Paul Wright, who is the director of, or chief scientific officer of CITRIS, who also shares an office right next to me, and he contributed to this. And I'd also like to thank Helios, because I've been involved with that, and some of the slides that you'll see are from Helios, which is part of LPL, but there are a lot of people from campus who are involved in it. So, what I'd like to do is to sort of connect two things. One is, what are the global energy needs? There's a lot of debate on energy. It was there on the president's speech yesterday, and alternative fuel and everything. There was a beautiful article by Dianne Feinstein in the Chronicle, in the op-ed column, Chronicle yesterday. And obviously, it's everyone's mind right now. It's a very complex issue, and by no means am I an expert in trying to understand what this complexity is. But what I'd like to do is to filter down, as best as I can, what are the main technical scientific issues. And I'll keep away from the politics and issues related to geopolitics, etc. But nevertheless, really try to filter, as I said, what are the global energy needs based on population, based on economic growth, and what technologies do we have here in Berkeley? And again, I don't, by no means I know all the technologies that are going on in the science and engineering that's going on in Berkeley. But nevertheless, whatever I know, I like to place it and see whether they really address those needs. If not the global needs, at least the US needs. And so that's what I'll attempt to do out here. Let me start with what are the drivers. We had an energy crisis in the 1970s, and it was a big one. I mean, there were lines of cars in front of the gas stations. There was no gasoline, or there was, but there was shortage. And that went away in the 80s. Reagan came and cut all the funding, and all renewable energy went away. And again, there's interest now. And the question is, do we have the same drivers? Or what are those drivers that were there before? Or is there anything new this time? So oil price is certainly one of the drivers, as we all know. And that was a driver in the 1970s also. But then the oil production went up, the price came down, and that went away. Energy insecurity has always been a driver, and now more than any time before. And that was, again, in the president's speech yesterday about getting away from foreign oil, etc. So that is certainly a driver. And this was there even last time. But that went away as well. Well, seemingly went away. And then there's atmospheric CO2, which was not quite there last time. It was there, but so that's far away in the future, 100 years from now, and we don't have to worry about it. But it's obviously less than 100 years from now, or from then, and we are here today with a serious problem of CO2, which is now a new driver. And the question is, when you put all these together, is it sustainable, or is it that some other person would come, president would come and say, okay, let's cut all the funding, we are okay. All right? We don't quite know at this point, but I'd like to make a case that I think this may be sustainable. I don't know whether it is or not. So let's talk about some numbers. So here's population energy equation. This is the population of the world, and this is from a paper, a very nice paper by Harvard, which came out in 98. It's a population, we are at about 6 point something billion people, and that's going to go to about 10 to 11 billion people in about 100 years. This is the GDP per capita, which is increasing. It's a good thing. You want the GDP, the production per person, to increase, and so that's going up. And this is the watts per GDP. That is the amount of energy that you need to produce a certain good or service. And that is going down, which is also means we are getting more efficient. And some countries, advanced countries, are more efficient than some of the developing countries. But nevertheless, globally speaking, at least the projections are that we are getting more efficient. Now, if you multiply these three, you get the total power consumption in the world. Okay? And the last one out here is carbon per energy. How much carbon do you produce per joule of energy that you generate? And that is going down, which basically says that we are getting less carbon intensive, which is a good thing. And that's going down. And if you multiply all four, you get a carbon emission rate. And so the question is, this is improving, this is improving, this is improving. Are we all improving? Except that this population is going up. And this GDP growth and power are very closely related. We know which countries are growing the GDP at a higher rate. China and India are growing at about almost 8% per year. And their energy requirements are going up proportionally. And so that GDP and energy are very, very closely related. So if you ask the question, how much energy is required, and this is only till 2001, and if you project it, the graph is not that different. This is the total power that you need, and it's going up linearly. And these are sort of where this power is consumed. Industrial out here, transportation, buildings, and agriculture out here. And this is the CO2 emission rate. And this is going linear, and I'll show you data beyond, projections beyond 2001, and they seem to be linear as well. There might be some inflections due to rapid growth of economies in China and India. But nevertheless, at least the conservative estimate, the best case, I should say, best case estimate, that is at linear. It's maybe actually worse than that. So if you ask the question, okay, well, that's fine. This is a trend that we can see. What kind of fuels are we going to use? And sort of give the global fuel picture. You find that this is a very common graph, which is, shows that we are sort of at the peak of oil and gas. The peak of coal, it hasn't quite reached, but nevertheless, oil and gas, we're sort of at the peak right now. And it's going to go down. But nevertheless, if you look at the area under this curve, which is often forgotten, it's almost equal to the area under the curve before. So there's a lot of oil and gas still remaining. Okay, and it's not that we're going to suddenly go to renewable fuels right away. We will be burning a lot of fossil fuels for the next 50 years, or perhaps even 100 years. And so that is there, and the coal still remains till 2100. There's enough capacity of coal around. But if you look at the oil reserve and talking about energy insecurity, and this is sort of obvious to everyone, is that here is most of the reserves of oil and natural gas in Soviet Union, etc. But certainly oil is right out here. On the other hand, if you look at where the other fuels are, coal, it's Asia, Europe, and North America. Okay, so if you look at this, the two aspects of fossil fuel, the two types of fossil fuel, coal is where the biggest economies are growing, and Middle East is where the oil reserves are. So if something happens to the Middle East and somehow the oil is cut off, guess which fuel we are going to use? It's going to be coal. Okay? And even if it is not cut off, it will be coal for large power production, electricity production. And that is very worrisome, as I will show. So I just want to show you the top 15 energy users are sort of low-income countries. This is United States, and this is China out here. The number 3 and number 4, Russia and India. Okay, so take these 4 out here. Now, India is not the 4th largest GDP. It's number 12 or 11 or 12. Germany, etc., Germany is somewhere out there, comes out here, but nevertheless it is sort of way down there because it is more efficient in how it uses its energy. So here, if you take these top energy users out here, and you ask the question, okay, what kind of fuel reserves do they have should something happen internationally? And it is coal. Because USA, Russia, and China have the biggest, and India have the biggest reserves of coal for at least 150 years. So if there's any push comes to shove, they are going to go to coal. And coal, with energy, in terms of the dollars for energy that you produce, is much cheaper than other energy sources. So given the economics of it, and given the reserves that people have, it's sort of, it doesn't take a genius to realize that if there is a push comes to shove, that's where it's going to go. Yeah.
So if you're going to use the coal, you have to convert it to the coal that is compatible with the oil. So
I'll come to that.
Yeah. So does that amount include with the processing fee or just the crude oil or the coal itself?
Coal itself. Okay. And the energy produced by coal today. Okay. Now, if you add other processes, there are other costs to that, and I'll come to that. Okay. So, how is coal used today? All right. So, coal, the way it is presently used is that you take coal, you pulverize it, and you burn it essentially to produce heat, and that heat is used to run gas turbines or steam turbines, and you produce electricity that way. And the problem is that, okay, you take air, and obviously, if there are any chemists, I give, pardon me for not balancing this equation, but nevertheless, you have basically carbon dioxide with NOx and some SOx because this coal is dirty, and nitrogen, and you're essentially heating up the nitrogen for nothing. Okay, and CO2 is mixed with nitrogen. It's predominantly nitrogen out here. What you really want to do, okay, is to somehow do this process. Okay, this is gasification, that you actually don't burn it with oxygen, but you steam it to produce hydrogen. And thereby, after that, you can either use fuel cells or just gas turbines and steam turbines to produce electricity. But this is not, while the technology is there today, it is not being used. And the reason it's not being used is that it's more expensive. Okay? But here, the advantage of going here is that you can get high concentrations of CO2 at the at the exhaust, whereas you don't have to get a dilute concentration. You get a dilute concentration out here, so you get a concentrated form of CO2, which you can potentially capture and take it away. So that's but of course you can take this hydrogen, you can do other things with it. If you take carbon monoxide and hydrogen, you can do a Fischer-Tropsch synthesis and produce gasoline. And that happens at about approximately $40 a barrel today. And China is actually implementing, and this was developed in South Africa when they had the embargo. And now China is implementing those plans in China so that they can produce gasoline in case there's a shortage of gasoline from Middle East. So that's as soon as you're talking about fossil fuel, these are all interchangeable. You can get to gasoline from coal. But the problem is, of course, the carbon intensity of that is way higher, at least 2 to maybe 3 times higher than what you have with gasoline or natural gas for that matter. So this is kind of worrisome, because if all the coal plants, it's about 1 per week in China, they're all going this route right now. So what do we do with the CO2? This is sort of US energy. These are all the sources out here, okay? And these are all where the consumption happens: residential, commercial, industrial, transportation. And these are all the sources. Coal right now, it's about 23%. Natural gas, crude oil, these are imports that are coming in. And if you look at where sort of renewables fall today, it's renewables is about 6% of the total energy consumption. And of that 6%, if you divide it, hydroelectric is a big percentage of that. And so is wood, for example, waste. And here is solar, and here is wind. So if you have to generate, if you look at this picture, we certainly know that solar has to be increased. After all, there's only one source of energy, from a continuous source of energy, which is the sun. So this has to increase. There's no question about it. But to get to the scale of these kind of energy sources, it's going to take a while. And the cost really has to come down. Okay? But that's where the research really needs to go. But the question is, what are we going to do from here till 20 years from now when all this solar and everything else? Are we going to still do this and burn all the fossil fuels and let the CO2 go? Or is there some other way to do that? I don't think I can give you an answer, but I'll give you some possibilities of what could be done. Yes?
Are we ignoring nuclear for purpose?
Oh, absolutely not. Nuclear is right here, and I'll talk about that. Yeah, I'll talk about that. Otherwise, Jasmina Vujic would kill me if I don't. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so if you talk about U.S. energy consumption, per capita energy consumption state-wise, and I just did it for a little gimmick out here. This is the average U.S., and here is California, which is really low energy consumption out here. And if you look on the right-hand side is Arkansas, Texas. There's a little reddish out here and bluish on this side. And given that the political climate is sort of, becoming almost 2008 right now, you might find this interesting. But nevertheless, this is the per capita, and we are actually doing very well, thanks to many of the the pioneers out here, Art Rosenfeld and others, who really proposed and pushed very hard on conservation, etc. I won't go into the details of this, but I'd like to just point out on the coal side. The coal goes mostly into electricity today. But you see this thing out here. This is coal and natural gas, and it converts this power into electricity for residential commercial use. And you see, look at the losses out here. And 27 out of 41. It's about 65% are losses. Where does this go, and why does this happen? I'll come to that. And this is basic thermodynamics. But the question is, can you still use, you can't violate second law and first law, but can you still work with it to somehow reduce this conversion loss, which is a big deal, because that's about 40% of the energy that is consumed in this country. Of course, if you start burning coal, the inconvenient truth, I think most of you know, I won't belabor this point, but this global temperature is going up, basically because of CO2 going up, and there's a historical trend to that. And historically, if you look at why there's huge amounts of CO2 way back, we're talking about billions of years back, how did it come down? And the way the CO2 level actually came down, at least the hypothesis, is that CO2 was absorbed in the limestone, and that formed carbonates. And that's how the CO2 was absorbed, and that reduced the CO2 level, reduced the temperature level on the Earth, and that's how life and everything started after that. But there is a big correlation between CO2 and temperature, and Gore has done a wonderful job in explaining that in this movie. Just to give you where the trends are, and these are the only equations that you will see in this graph, because these equations are obviously not there in Gore's movie, thankfully. If you look at the carbon in the atmosphere and the rate of change, you can write you can't go wrong with a rate equation of the emission minus the absorption. And the biggest sink of CO2 is essentially the oceans. And so that's, and the emission is what we all know about, with coal plants, etc. So what is happening in terms of CO2? If you look at this equilibrium of atmospheric CO2 and the ocean CO2, let's take the best case scenario. You produce CO2, instantly it goes up, and it comes to an equilibrium with the ocean. It gets absorbed. Obviously, that doesn't happen. There are delays, etc. But let's say it instantly happens so that it sucks out that CO2 and goes into the ocean to form, to make the ocean acidic. But nevertheless, this is Henry's law. Okay, so there's an equilibrium constant, and the amount of CO2 absorbed in the ocean is given by this. And if you do that, you can rewrite this equation this way, so that you can get the atmospheric CO2 as a function of emission rate. Now, if the emission rate is linear, as we know, and this is projection till 2100, guess what will happen? The atmospheric emission, the level of carbon in the atmosphere will go as T squared. And that is the best case scenario. This is not counting what may happen due to heating of the permafrost, etc., where other gases might come out. This is the best case scenario. So if you plot that, the carbon in the atmosphere today, it's about 400. This is carbon in the atmosphere in billion tons, which is, you can convert that to parts per million. So let me just say that it's about 380 parts per million today. And at 2, if this trend, just t squared, not t raised to 2.5 or something, if this continues, we'll be at about 600 ppm in 50 years, which is really scary because there's some of the changes are irreversible by then. We cannot go to even sort of double this thing. Beyond double, we are essentially screwed. So the question is, how do we turn this around? Okay, and that's the big question that everyone's asking, how we turn this around. And do we have the technology today? There are some short term, and we have the technology today to implement, and there are cost issues, etc. But there are some long-term research issues. And that's where the Berkeley comes in. And the question is, what do we do? And you can, there are these wedges that people talk about. Nevertheless, you can, the options for emission reduction, conservation, renewable, nuclear, coal to gas substitution, carbon capture and storage. And I'll go through each one of these and explain. So the basic point is that you can't do one thing and get away with it. You have to do everything. Okay? That's the basic message. That if you do just one thing and hope that everything is going to be hunky-dory, that's not going to happen. Because the problem is so big and so complex that you have to do everything. And that's where Berkeley comes in. Why? Because if you look at, in fact, I was in a meeting with our president, Bob Dines, who actually explained it very well, and I really liked the way he explained it. What is unique about UC system? I mean, of course, he's talking UC system. Let's just translate that to Berkeley. Okay? I used to be in UC Santa Barbara. Okay, so we'll include UC Santa Barbara as well, and Santa Cruz, and all the CITRIS members. But let's just, thank you. But let's just, let's just say, let's concentrate on Berkeley. One of the good things about UC system and Berkeley is that we are big. Okay, as opposed to Stanford, we are big. We have people in all departments and with this big lab next door that we can address big problems. Caltech, for example, may not be able to do that because they may have one person in solar photovoltaics. They may have one person in carbon capture. But if you want to address the whole thing, you cannot do that with one or two people. And that is the advantage of being big, public institutions, that we can address this problem. And so let me just walk you through and give you a few examples of how we can do that. So again, what are the drivers? Oil price, I don't think is really a driver. I mean, to be honest, it's just in my opinion. Because if, for example, the renewables bite into the pie of the oil, their oil price will be reduced and the renewables will be pushed out. Just economics, the business-wise, it will be pushed out. Unless you put regulations of CO2, this will not happen. Okay, at least for the next 50 years, because there's enough oil and natural gas. Right now, the natural gas that is pumped out is actually pumped down into the ground so as to keep the price level the same. Otherwise, there's too much of natural gas at this point. All right? So oil, and as I said, oil can be produced from coal by Fischer-Tropsch at about $40 a barrel or so. Strategic, definitely, because independence from foreign oil. And that's a sort of a national security, if you may, foreign policy issue. And I'm not going to go into that. But this is a universal driver that we did not have in the 1970s that we have today. Okay? And if CO2, especially with a price tag on CO2, which is now coming on board, and regulation and cap, now you can do economics, which I think is the best incentive to really create technology and drive the science as well. Okay? So if that is the metric, really, then we should measure things with how much CO2, index, or how much value you can create by reducing CO2. And I'm trying to engage the business school in creating a value sort of evaluation and in seeing if you take a technology, how much CO2 in terms of dollar amount do you really save or do you really reduce? And that that economics and the business side has to come in. So I won't go into details of this. Energy conversion processes, light to fuel is where Helios comes in. I'll talk a little bit about that. And electricity to light. I mean, all this scenario that Helios is really focusing on is really light to fuel somehow. And what I may add, and this is something which has been neglected for a long time, and due to a variety of reasons, but this is something which really should be pursued, because at the end of the day, if you are thinking 50 years from now, when coal is now getting short, or oil is sort of ending now. The question is, what other sources do we have besides nuclear, okay, and light? And I don't think there's much. Even if you consider wind, that is essentially solar. Hydroelectric is still solar at the end of the day. But at this point, I may add that if you look at fuel to electricity or fuel to work, thermodynamically work, 90% of the energy is converted by this process. Fuel to heat, which is thermal, and thermal to mechanical electricity, even at the cost of, even after paying the penalty of Carnot. And the question is, why would you do that? Why can't you go directly from fuel to electricity using fuel cells? Then you're not subject to, you're still subject to second law, but not Carnot. But why would you do that? Why would you go this way? And the answer is that this is really the only scalable level to large-scale power, because it's volumetric. These are all surface processes. And if you want to create gigawatts or terawatts of power, it is extremely hard to do that using surface processes like fuel cells. You've got to go volumetric, and this is the only way to do it. And if that's the case, are there opportunities today that we can see in this way so that we can at least address the CO2 problem through conservation, through other things? So that's what I'll talk about a little bit later on. Okay, so what can Berkeley offer? And this is sort of now that big question. Can we take these wedges, this is emission rate of CO2 in years, and what we really want to do is to somehow turn that around as opposed to getting it going linear. And you can cut different wedges. And Sokolow in Princeton has done a beautiful article, in Scientific American, which explains that in very simplistic terms. And I would encourage you to read that. But nevertheless, let's take each one of those things. Conservation, I mean, we can do that today. Power-aware buildings, waste heat recovery, fuel efficiency in transportation, and I'll sort of walk you through a few what Berkeley can offer. And I'll just highlight some of the technologies that Berkeley has. So, can we do this? Can we essentially remove these CO2 producing elements one by one and address this problem comprehensively? Okay, let's talk about buildings. And this is where, for example, CITRIS really can make a huge difference. Because a lot of the energy, if I may flash that view graph in front, a lot of the energy is going into residential and commercial buildings. And there's, the question is, can we have any kind of conservation? Right now, we hardly do any conservation. The only thing I do, for example, is that when I leave home, I just turn off the heater. That's all. But there's much more you can actually do. And so this is some smart demand response in smart houses. For example, the price of electricity varies. Okay, during the day, and in the middle of the day is very high. At the end of the night, it's lower. Is there any way you can turn off or turn on systems based on sensors that you have in houses, which measures the electricity that is that's being used, correlates that with the price that is coming in, and perhaps the CO2 that is being, the penalty that you would pay, and optimize in a house using wireless networks to bring down the power consumption and CO2 emission per house. That if this technology exists today, it just has to be sort of modified in some way and implemented in households. And this would be one very simple way of addressing energy efficiency and energy conservation. So right now, in fact, there's a move of making new meters using micromode sensors, and this is PG&E plans to do that, I think, since July 2006. Is trying to use new kinds. These are the old meters. If you've seen the old meters at home, that's what it looks like. I think we can do better than that in terms of actually monitoring and measuring what is coming in. And in fact, why can't we have one kind of universal energy meter which measures the heat going out, the light coming in, and somehow optimizes so that we can store energy inside the house? Now, waste heat recovery. Let me just, and this is something that we do in our lab, and I'll just highlight that. As I said, 65% of the energy that you produce from coal is thrown out. Why is that? Because it is what second law tells you to do. You can't violate that. So most 90% of the world's power is produced, or power, energy is produced this way. You got a hot source, you got a cold, you put an engine in between, you draw some heat, produce work, and you've got to dump some heat. Otherwise, you have a perpetual motion machine, which violates second law. And so this is almost 80 to 90% of the world's power. Mechanical power in transportation as well as electrical power in turbines, etc., is produced this way. And that's about 90%, it's about, let's say, approximately 10 terawatts of power, because the total power consumption today, it's about 13 terawatts. And efficiency is about 40%. It's about actually 35%, but let's say 40%, which means if you're generating 10 terawatts out here, there's 25 terawatts that are coming in and 15 terawatts that are dumped. Okay? Now, if the dumping happens at room temperature, there's nothing you can do about it. But that dumping doesn't happen at room temperature. It happens at least at 100 degrees Celsius above ambient. I mean, just take, for example, your car engine. The coolant that you use, you need a coolant to cool that down. The coolant that comes out of the engine is about 100 degrees Celsius. And then you just essentially dump that heat. Okay? That's just one example. But at least it's probably more than 100 degrees Celsius. Even if you use a regenerator, if you do not have a temperature difference with the ambient, it's going to take infinite amount of time to transfer that heat. Okay? So is there any way, and that heat, by the way, at 100 degrees Celsius, cannot be put into a gas turbine and produce electricity. It's just this low-grade heat. But if there's any way you can actually put a device out here which produces work, even at efficiency of 3%, 10% of Carnot, you can produce then about half a terawatt of power. If you could do that in a scalable, cost-effective way. That's half a terawatt. And incidentally, the power capacity of the USA as of 2005 is about a terawatt. So this is half the US capacity you're talking about. So how do we do that? And this is where, and this is a technology which we are working on, and it's far from, sort of reality at this point. But, thermal electricity. Can we take heat and produce electricity directly? Okay, using semiconductors or some other kinds of materials. And these are the current devices. And it turns out, if you look at the fraction of Carnot efficiency in terms of this parameter, which is a figure of merit, and I won't go into the details of that. Right now, the figure of merit is 1. And using exotic materials like bismuth and tellurium, I don't think we have enough of that to do that half terawatt in the world. Okay? So this is really not the answer. But that's where we are today. If we can somehow increase the fraction of the Carnot efficiency to about 30%, then we have a chance of really addressing this problem. But to do that in a cost-effective manner, using materials which are readily available, like metals like iron, copper, and organics. And that's exactly what we are attempting to do. And we have a paper coming out in Science right now to show thermoelectricity in organic, inorganic heterostructures. These are molecules with metal particles, these are assemblies, and trying to use these so that we can, in fact, hopefully spin coat these and make rolls of these and attach it to heat engines so that we can grab electricity out of it while it's dumping the heat. So that's what we're attempting to do. Now, fuel efficiency in transportation. Now, this has been traditionally going on for a long time in mechanical engineering. Colleagues out here we're looking at combustion. And combustion has been there for a long time. However, the fuels may be different in the future. There may be other kinds of fuel, not exactly the gasoline that we use. Right now, as we know, is E15, E85, that's going to come into the picture. The question is, how would you redesign the engine to optimize the efficiency of these kinds of engines? And this is something that, there's a lot of computations, a lot of experiments that are going on. Bob Dibble, J.Y. Chen, and others, Michael Franklock, and they're looking into those kinds of things. And this is something which we can do today. The other thing that is about vehicles, and I'm putting these two pictures because they're both from the Bay Area. This is Cal Cars, and this is a plug-in hybrid which is not available. And I would love to have this car, which is fully electric, which goes about 250 miles, but the price tag is beyond my paycheck. It's about 100K right now. Nevertheless, this is, I really believe, this is the future. Because you can get 100 miles per gallon, and it's one of those wedges. If you can just improve, Dianne Feinstein's article, and she's putting together a bill in Congress to increase the fuel efficiency from 25 miles per gallon to 35. We can do 100 if we have the right technology to do that. And these are plug-in hybrid. Right now you can take a Prius and boost it up with batteries, but the cost is $10,000 extra over and above the 24 that you may pay. And that could be cost prohibitive. So what is the technology that we need? And the technology is batteries. And there's John Newman and others in chemical engineering who are looking at, and Nitash Balsara, who are looking at these are really materials problems. And here is a lithium-ion battery with lithium. The fundamental issues out here are what kind of electrodes would you, what kind of anode? Lithium anode is the best one because it's just the highest concentration of lithium. But what about the cathode? How would you increase the power density or energy density in a battery? And the power density is that if you have the right kind of nanostructure, because you want to increase surface area, and if you have the right kind of separator to block any kind of dendrites getting through this, then that's a technology which will really change the way transportation is done. Because I don't think personally that fuel cells in the cars will happen soon, because you need a whole infrastructure of hydrogen, etc., which is not there. You have the electric infrastructure in the house today. And that seems like a much, much better way to do it, at least in my opinion. Okay, alternative fuels. And by alternative fuels, we can take out one of those wedges. Now, I may add that these sizes of the wedges don't pay too much attention, because these are all projection. But nevertheless, it is a wedge. So let me just, my computer is very slow. This is Helios. So Helios is a program which has been put together under the leadership of Steve Chu, Paul Alivisatos, Jay Kiesling, etc. And what is it about? It is about the ultimate way, besides nuclear, to convert to have carbon-free energy. And that is our really only other source of energy, which is sunlight, a continuous source, to fuel. Okay, and why fuel? Why not electricity? Because fuel is the best way to store it. The problem with electricity is that once you produce electricity, you can't really store large amounts of energy. So the best way to do that is really through fuels. And there are multiple paths, and Helios has all these paths. Okay, one is the photovoltaics to electricity to using electrochemistry to kinds of any fuel out here. And the other is these kinds of microbes or artificial photosynthesis or plants. The question is, which is the best way to do that? And I don't think there is an answer to it, but we can evaluate it on the energy, on how much net gain of energy, how much net gain of CO2 you get out of these processes. And the jury is out on those in many of these cases. For example, okay, I'll just give you some examples of how the technology that is produced in Berkeley could be useful. Now, this is photovoltaics. Here is plastic photovoltaic, which will bring the cost down. So in photovoltaics, you really have to compete with silicon right now. And the silicon efficiency is about 10%, and it's expensive. And at the end of the day, it's like how much dollars per watt, how many cents per kilowatt hour do you really, can you pay? And it's an order of magnitude off from coal or nuclear, for that matter. So you really have to bring down the cost. Either you bring down the cost, or you increase the efficiency. Those are the two options. And this is an attempt to bring down the cost using nanostructures. Why nanostructured materials? Because if you take these polymers and it absorbs light and produces electrons and holes and excitons, the exciton diffusion length is on the order of 20 nanometers. After 20 nanometers, you just recombine and produce a photon, and that's it. You can't grab the electrons and the holes. So you've got to put electrodes within about 20 nanometers to be able to absorb them. And that needs some materials to be able to do that, and architectures that can do that. And there's a whole bunch of research going on with Alivisatos, Peidong Yang, Rachel Siegelman, Alex Zettel, others who are looking, Jean Frichet, who are looking at these kinds of structures and materials to do that. There are opportunities of multi-photon excitation. If you have sort of quantum dots, for example, quantum structures, what happens then is that you have much more Coulombic interaction in these materials, so that if you produce one exciton, that can produce multiple excitons in this material, and thereby you can increase the efficiency of these devices. And I won't go into the details of that, except that this is all going on today. At the end of the day, though, if you're just interested in electricity, you still have to compete with silicon and at the price level and the performance level. But if you're interested in taking these devices and producing a fuel, that's a different issue. There you have to use photoelectrochemistry, and there's a lot of research now, at least proposed in Helios and going on, to see if you can take a photovoltaic device and instead of producing electricity, make it in such a way that it produces hydrogen or it produces another kinds of fuel directly without going through the electricity, grabbing and then converting it. And that would be really very, very interesting, because then you're not just competing with silicon. That game is over then. It's a different game that you're playing then. I won't go into the details of this. There's a beautiful work going on in trying to harness elements of the photosynthetic process and integrating into devices to produce energy. And Heinz Frey is looking into that. And I don't understand this, first of all, so I won't even attempt to go into these details out here. Now, in terms of there's a lot of discussion on ethanol or butanol and biodiesel. There are really two kinds of fuels that we're talking about in terms of biofuels. One is sort of corn and sugarcane ethanol, and the other is cellulosic ethanol. And I'll talk very briefly on the biodiesel side. Now, in corn ethanol, I mean, if you heard the president speak yesterday, he's talking about by 2020, if I remember, 35 billion gallons of ethanol that's produced. Right now, we are at about, I think, 5 billion gallons or so. So that's 7 times more in the next 20 years, approximately. If you are to produce that by corn, we have serious problems from ethanol because of a variety of issues. Because the amount of CO2 that you produce in producing ethanol itself, and that cuts into the food supply. So really, if we can get to cellulosic, and that is really the consensus, if we can get to the cellulosic ethanol, we would be in much better shape than trying to produce from corn and sugarcane, for example. Sugarcane is still better. So that, of course, requires basic science in trying to produce enzymes artificially in large, scalable amounts at low cost in, for example, cellulase, which is an enzyme which breaks down cellulose. But cellulose is it's really attached to lignin. So you need another enzyme, lignase, to break down lignin. Otherwise, if you take a piece of wood, it's got cellulose and lignin in there, and how do you break it down? So that requires basic science to do that, and that's some of the work that Jay Kiesling and others are doing. The other part is the biodiesel, and there's some beautiful work going on, and this is Tassios Melis in the plant and 5 minutes. Okay, all right, okay. In plant and microbial biology, in looking at algae, which produces oil. So this is an algae, species of algae, which produces a lot of oil. And there's another, but it grows very slowly. There's another species of algae which produces very fast, but does not grow. And the genomes have not been decoded. And so with the Joint Genome Institute out here, what they're trying to do is to decode the genome of both these and make hybrids so that it produces oil and reproduces fast. And if you could do that, at least the projection is that you can get to about 65 cents per gallon of oil, of biodiesel. And that, I think, if you can reach that, that'll be very useful. And let me just very briefly say about nuclear. There are much better speakers out here on campus who know about this thing. But, nuclear energy exists today. Okay? There are issues about cost. And if you look at the total cost of energy, in installing a power plant and over this lifespan, it comes to around about 7 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas coal is about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a little bit of cost issue out there, but it's not prohibitive. And we can get into it today. Of course, there are issues about what kind of design, and in terms of there are questions about safety. And this is just the data from Per Peterson about the safety. This is times 10. And here is nuclear safety as to other industries out here. And it is really, the safety issue is not there today. We are about 30 years away from 3 Mile Island. And that issue, I think, can be put to rest. So issues about waste still remain, but that can be managed. So I think nuclear can happen today if the cost issue is reduced. And right now, if you're a nuclear engineer, nuclear engineering graduate, you have multiple job offers. That's not a problem right now. And the Japanese are buying out Westinghouse because they know that that's a possibility. Let me just end with carbon capture. And this is a huge, again, let me come back to, what are the different ways of taking carbon dioxide from a power plant? What do you do with it? The most cost-effective way, I mean, you can put it down in the ocean. There are some issues, serious issues with that. You can mineralize it, which is a very expensive and slow process, or you can put it down underground. Okay, and that seems like the best way of doing it right now, and it's cost-effective. But the question is, how do you grab CO2? From an IGCC plant, as I showed you, you get very pure or concentrated levels of CO2. But if you're doing this, you've got to isolate that CO2 from the flue gas. How do you do that? And this is something that we are trying right now. We're just starting to do that, is using biological catalysts to convert CO2 to carbonate, bicarbonate, and extract out the CO2, and then convert the bicarbonate back to CO2 in a concentrated form. So at least you can then, if this works, then you can hook it up with a regular power plant, which is where everyone's going because of the cost issues, and then reduce the carbon dioxide burden. And I would love to, if there's any business students out here, love to work with some business guys to really put a value on this. And what cost would this process, could this process tolerate so as to be profitable over what is done today? Let me just end now, given my time is coming up. The Berkeley solution, well, it's really all these things. And as I said comprehensively, that if you want to attack this problem comprehensively, you have to do all of these. And I hope I've convinced you that the Berkeley campus, and together with LBL, has the possibility of doing that. And that's the local technology they're talking about, addressing the global needs. Let me stop out here. Thank you very much again.
Hi, that was a really great talk. Thank you very much. Regarding batteries in cars, I'm quite familiar with the work that's going on up on the Hill, and it's getting to a point, at least with separators, where it's like getting sort of blood from a stone because of the diffusion barriers. But once you solve that problem, there's still, I think, even with nanotechnology, a big problem with cyclability and heat generation. And as batteries get bigger, those problems actually get worse.
Yeah.
So do you really think that, in terms of an engineering solution, batteries can overtake, say, biodiesel, in terms of like a true infrastructural solution?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There are many issues with battery that I did not touch on. In fact, Tesla Motors just hired a heat transfer guy I know of to address that problem because it heats up. And there are materials. I think the separator problem, there's some new technology coming out of Nitash Balsara's lab, which is addressing that particular issue, and maybe that is solved using some polymers. But the heat transfer issues is certainly there. But heat transfer technology, there's a lot of technology exists today which has come from the nuclear side, interestingly enough, and the microelectronics cooling, which could be applied out there. And that's why Tesla is hiring these kinds of people. So I think there are engineering solutions. I don't know the details of that, or what those, Tesla is now going to tell me what those problems, but I think the LBL people, I think that can be addressed. There is room out there. I don't know whether there'll be a Moore's law in battery technology, but the slope may not be that high, but I think there will be a slope because the demand is so high. In terms of whether it addresses, competing with biodiesel, you have to look at the cost and the CO2 cost for that, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I think we have time for one more question. Then.
Okay, there is one technology you haven't dealt with, which is distributed power generation, particularly with cogeneration, the use of the waste heat within static power plants. Industry is nearly half of the energy use, and so currently distributed power generation 7%, but with automation we can make a lot smaller machinery rather than have centralized power plants. So how is CITRIS dealing with this possibility?
Yeah. Well, I think that the technology exists today, as you pointed out. And that's basically going back to power plant design and energy use, which has been there since the 60s. In terms of new technology, I don't know whether, unless you have new materials and new heat transfer processes, which can enhance that power. I don't know if it's like wind, for example. I didn't cover wind because there's no new technology in wind that you can actually use or develop in Berkeley that you can, perhaps commercialize later on. So I don't know exactly whether there's a new technology need for that, but certainly that can be done today, and as he's pointed out, that is being done today.
Okay, I think we're out of time now, so let's just give him one more round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.